Her best friend looked me straight in the eye and said, "Be careful with her, she's complicated." I should have listened. But the first time I saw her, the warning didn't matter anymore. It began, strangely enough, with a warning. Not from her, but from someone who had known her far longer than I had. We were sitting at a dimly lit bar, music humming in the background, when her best friend leaned toward me with a half-smile that wasn't really a smile at all. She swirled the ice in her glass, her eyes briefly serious. "You should be careful with her," she said quietly. "She's complicated. Don't get too close unless you're ready." Her words weren't sharp, not meant to scare me. They carried the weight of experience, the kind of warning that comes from affection, not malice. And yet, the moment she said it, curiosity sparked in me like a match. I asked what she meant, but she only shook her head and laughed, as though she'd already said too much. That warning stayed with me. It should have made me cautious, but instead it stirred something inside me, a mixture of intrigue and defiance. Because when someone tells you not to touch fire, part of you can't help but wonder what the flame feels like. The first time I saw her was only a few days later. She was standing by the cafe counter, waiting for her drink. She must have been 42, maybe 43, though you wouldn't have guessed it right away. There was something about her, not the kind of beauty that shouts for attention, but the kind that holds it effortlessly. Her hair was pulled back in a loose knot, a few strands falling forward to soften her features. The light caught the faintest lines near her eyes, the kind carved by laughter and late nights, and somehow they only added to her allure. I remember the way she stood, not stiff, not posed, but grounded. As though she belonged exactly where she was, no need to prove anything to anyone. People moved around her, yet she seemed untouched by the noise and rush. When she finally turned and noticed me staring, her gaze didn't falter. There was a quiet confidence in it, steady and calm, and it unnerved me more than I expected. Introductions came naturally, though my voice felt a little too formal. When our hands met, it was only a handshake, brief, polite, the kind two strangers exchange without thinking. And yet I felt it. The warmth of her skin, the firmness of her grip, the subtle pause before she let go. It was nothing, really. But it wasn't nothing to me. Walking away that day, the warning echoed again in my mind, "Don't get too close unless you're ready." I thought of her best friend's eyes, serious behind the teasing words, and wondered what kind of history lived inside this woman, what heartbreaks, what secrets, what kind of strength it took to be both graceful and guarded at once. I told myself to tread carefully. But even then, even at the very beginning, I knew the truth. I wasn't going to listen. It didn't take long before our paths crossed again. This time it wasn't by accident, or at least, not entirely. I'd gone back to that same cafe a few days later, though I told myself it was just for the coffee. Maybe that was true, but when I spotted her sitting at a corner table, a book open in front of her and a half-finished cup beside her, I knew coffee wasn't the reason I lingered. She looked different in that softer light. The cafe was quieter than usual, the afternoon sun spilling through wide windows, painting golden streaks across the wooden tables. She was absorbed in her book, turning the pages with the ease of someone who had made reading a lifelong ritual. Her brow furrowed slightly as she concentrated, and when the corner of her mouth lifted in an almost imperceptible smile, I found myself wondering what line, what phrase, had touched her enough to draw that reaction. When she noticed me, her expression shifted, a flicker of recognition, followed by a smile that felt both warm and cautious. She gestured toward the empty chair across from her. "You again," she said lightly. Her voice had that calm richness to it, low but assured, like someone who didn't need to raise her tone to be heard. I sat down, suddenly more nervous than I wanted to admit. The conversation began simply. The book she was reading, a comment I made about the author, her surprised glance that I actually knew his work. What started as small talk became something else, something slower, more natural. She had a sharp wit, clever in the way she chose her words, but she never used it to belittle. When she teased me about my age, "You must have been in high school when this book was published," there was a spark in her eyes, playful rather than dismissive. I laughed it off, though a part of me felt the gap between us more acutely in that moment. 26 and 42. A line most people would hesitate to cross. But as she spoke, age felt less like a barrier and more like a lens. She saw the world differently, and I wanted to see it through her. What struck me most, though, wasn't her intellect or her beauty, it was her ease. The way she folded her hands loosely on the table, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup absent-mindedly. The way she leaned forward when she was curious about my thoughts, giving me the sense that she was actually listening. In a world where conversations so often feel rushed or distracted, hers was the kind that made you want to linger. And then there was that moment, small, almost nothing, yet unforgettable. As we sat there, our legs stretched beneath the table, her knee brushed mine. At first, I thought it was accidental. But when I didn't move, and neither did she, the contact remained, light, unspoken, carrying more weight than any words could. I looked up at her then, meeting her gaze. She didn't acknowledge it, didn't pull back, just continued talking as if everything was normal. But the tiniest curve at the edge of her mouth told me she knew exactly what she was doing. And that fleeting touch, that simple brush of her knee against mine, stayed with me long after I left the cafe. The warning from her best friend still hovered in my mind, but in that moment, it already felt too late. Whatever danger she carried, I was already stepping closer. It started happening more often after that cafe afternoon. At first, I told myself it was coincidence, the way she seemed to appear in the same spaces I found myself. But after the third, fourth, fifth encounter, I stopped believing in chance. Some invisible thread was pulling us toward each other, weaving our days together in quiet, unexpected ways. One evening I walked into the little bookstore I always visited, the kind with narrow aisles and uneven wooden floors, and there she was. She stood in front of the classics section, her head tilted as she read the spines. Her fingers moved gently across the books, pausing here and there, as though she were reacquainting herself with old friends. She noticed me before I could decide whether to approach, her lips curving into that half-smile I was already beginning to recognize. "You again," she said softly, and her tone carried a mixture of amusement and inevitability, as though she'd been expecting me all along. We talked between the shelves, the air filled with the faint scent of old paper and dust. It wasn't small talk anymore. She spoke about the books that had shaped her, the moments in her life when she had clung to words because they were steadier than people. I listened, struck by the vulnerability that slipped through her usually confident exterior. She didn't share details recklessly. Each confession felt deliberate, chosen, as though she was testing how much of her truth I could carry. Later that week, we ran into each other again, this time at a late-night coffee run. The cafe was nearly empty, the city outside quiet and dim under streetlights. We sat by the window, steam curling up from our mugs. She told me about her marriage, not in detail, but enough for me to see the fracture lines it had left behind. There was no bitterness in her voice, only a quiet acceptance, like someone who had grown used to carrying the weight. I wanted to reach across the table then, to offer something more than just listening. But I stayed still, caught between wanting to ease her burden and knowing she wasn't asking me to. She looked at me in that moment, her eyes steady, and I realized she wasn't afraid of silence. She wasn't afraid of letting pauses linger. And maybe that's what drew me to her most. She didn't fill spaces with noise. She filled them with presence. At one point, as she emphasized something, her hand reached out almost unconsciously, her fingertips brushing against my forearm. It was nothing more than a fleeting touch, but the effect was immediate. The warmth of her skin against mine felt grounding, like a reminder that this connection wasn't just words and glances. It was real, tangible. When she pulled her hand back, I could still feel the echo of it, an invisible imprint that lingered long after. Walking home that night, I thought again of her best friend's warning, "Don't get too close unless you're ready." But what struck me was the realization that it wasn't about her being dangerous. It was about how effortless it was to want her, how easily she could slip past my defenses. And even as I tried to resist, some part of me knew resistance was already slipping away. The pull between us was undeniable by then, but with it came a weight I couldn't ignore. It wasn't only her best friend's words echoing in the back of my mind, though they were still there, steady as a drumbeat. It was also the quiet questions that began to surface whenever I was alone. What did it mean, the two of us sitting together late at night as if it were the most natural thing in the world? What would people say if they saw us? And more than that, was I enough for her? She was 42, a woman who had lived, who had scars and stories that gave her the kind of depth you can't fake. I was 26, still trying to figure myself out, still stumbling in ways she had already mastered. The age difference stretched between us like a shadow, one I could pretend to ignore when we were laughing over coffee, but one that returned in the quiet moments, heavy and insistent. I began to notice her hesitation, too. The way her eyes softened when I spoke, but then quickly shifted away. The pauses that lingered just a second too long before she changed the subject. The warmth in her touch that cooled the moment she seemed to realize what she'd done. One night, after an evening out with a few mutual friends, I offered her a ride home. She accepted with a simple nod, and soon it was just the two of us in my car, the hum of the engine filling the silence. The radio played low, some old ballad, its melody faint beneath the rhythm of the tires on the road. She sat angled slightly toward the window, the streetlights sliding across her profile, first in shadow, then in gold. There was something almost cinematic about it, and I caught myself memorizing the shape of her features, the quiet strength in the way she held herself. I wanted to say something, anything, to bridge the silence. But every word I rehearsed in my head felt clumsy, too heavy, or too revealing. She broke the quiet first, her voice soft. "You don't have to keep doing this," she said. "Doing what?" I asked. "Being here," she replied after a pause, still looking out the window. "You have your whole life ahead of you. You don't need to get tangled up in mine." Her words were careful, not dismissive, but they carried an edge of fear, as if she was trying to build a wall between us before something broke through. At the next red light, I glanced at her. She was still turned away, but her hand rested lightly on the center console, just inches from mine. I didn't overthink it. My fingers drifted toward hers, brushing against her skin. The contact was fleeting, a whisper of touch, but it sent a charge through me. She didn't pull away immediately. For a breath, it felt as if she was about to lace her fingers through mine. But then the light turned green, and she withdrew her hand, folding it neatly into her lap. When we reached her home, she thanked me softly, her voice steadier than her eyes. As she stepped out, I sat in the driver's seat, gripping the wheel, heart pounding with all the things left unsaid. And for the first time, I realized that hesitation could be just as powerful as desire. 4 days after that car ride, her words stayed with me. "You don't need to get tangled up in mine." It was meant to push me away, I knew that. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized she wasn't warning me for her sake, she was warning me for mine. Still, I kept showing up. Not in grand gestures or declarations, but in the small, ordinary ways. A text to recommend her a book. A walk shared after running into each other at the corner store. A lingering conversation that stretched far past midnight when neither of us wanted to let go of the silence. It was on one of those late evenings, sitting together at her kitchen table, that the first real crack in her armor appeared. The room was dimly lit, just a single lamp glowing in the corner. The rain tapped against the windows, a steady rhythm that seemed to hush the world outside. She had poured us both a glass of wine, and for a while, we spoke about nothing in particular, her garden, my work, the places we both wanted to travel someday. Then the conversation shifted, almost imperceptibly. She grew quieter, her fingers tracing circles on the rim of her glass. "You know," she began, her voice low, "I've gotten good at keeping people at arm's length." I looked at her, but I didn't interrupt. She stared into the wine, as if the words lived somewhere in its dark surface. "I think," she exhaled slowly, shaking her head, "I think I do it because it's easier to push people away before they can walk away on their own. It's safer that way." There was no defiance in her tone, no attempt to mask it with humor. It was a confession, plain and unguarded. For the first time, I saw the truth behind her best friend's warning. She wasn't dangerous because of who she was. She was dangerous because of how easy it was to want her, and how quickly she could retreat into the safety of her walls, leaving someone standing alone on the outside. I wanted to tell her I wasn't going anywhere, that I wasn't afraid of the weight she carried. But the words felt too heavy in that moment, too soon. Instead, I let silence do the work. I reached across the table and placed my hand gently over hers. At first, her fingers twitched, as if they meant to slip away. Old instincts, I guessed. But then, slowly, almost reluctantly, they curled around mine. It wasn't a dramatic gesture, just the quiet acceptance of contact, of being held. Her hand was warm, her skin soft against my palm. But what struck me most was the way her shoulders eased, the tiniest shift, as though she had been holding herself upright for far too long and finally allowed herself to rest, just a little. She didn't say anything more, and she didn't need to. That simple act, letting her hand stay in mine, was more vulnerable than any words could have been. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't before. I didn't just want to be close to her. I wanted to be the place where she could finally let her guard down. The night we walked together, the air was cool enough that each breath left a faint cloud in front of us. The city had quieted, the usual noise softened into the hum of distant traffic and the occasional bark of a dog echoing through the stillness. It felt like the world had pressed pause, leaving only the two of us moving beneath the pools of light cast by the street lamps. She walked with her hands tucked into the pockets of her coat, her shoulders relaxed but her gaze forward, as if the path itself was easier to focus on than me. I matched her pace, close enough to feel the subtle warmth radiating from her presence but careful not to brush against her unless the sidewalk narrowed and we had no choice. We talked at first about nothing important, the chill in the air, the restaurant we had just left, the way the leaves scattered across the pavement in little whirlwinds. But underneath the words, there was something else, a current pulling us both deeper. Every pause between sentences stretched a little longer than it needed to. Every glance lasted a fraction of a second too long. At one point, she laughed softly at something I said. The sound was quiet but real, and it made her eyes brighten in a way that caught me off guard. Then she tilted her head, studying me with a half-smile that seemed to carry both affection and a hint of sadness. "You really don't see it, do you?" she said. "See what?" I asked. She shook her head, her breath clouding in the air. "You're too young to understand some things. What it means to carry the years. To know how quickly people change their minds, or how fragile trust can be. You think it's simple. But it's not. I could have let it pass, could have nodded and stayed quiet. But something in her tone, that mixture of warning and longing, pushed me past hesitation. I understand more than you think," I said quietly. She stopped walking for just a moment, her boots scuffing against the pavement. The streetlight above us flickered, buzzing faintly, casting her face in alternating shadow and gold. Her eyes locked onto mine, searching, as if she needed to see whether I truly meant it. We stood there in the stillness, the night pressing in around us. My heart beat hard in my chest, loud enough that I swore she could hear it. And then, without saying anything, she reached up. It was a small, almost unconscious gesture, adjusting the scarf I had carelessly wrapped around my neck. Her fingers brushed against the side of my throat, light and unhurried. The warmth of her skin lingered even after the touch was gone, and I felt my breath catch. Her hand slipped away, but she didn't step back. For a few seconds neither of us moved. The silence between us wasn't empty anymore. It was heavy, charged, filled with everything we hadn't said. If the world had ended in that moment, I think I would have been content. Because in her eyes I saw it, the same pull I had been feeling all along. We didn't speak of it. Not yet. But we didn't need to. The confession had already been made, wordlessly, in the space where her hand had touched my skin. The rain had been falling since late afternoon, steady and unhurried, drumming softly against the windows of her living room. By the time I arrived that evening, the streets glistened with reflections of streetlights, and the air carried that fresh, almost electric scent that follows a storm. She let me in with a quiet smile, one that seemed both hesitant and relieved. There were no plans, no occasion, just two people drawn together by something neither of us could deny anymore. We settled on the couch, a blanket draped carelessly over the back, the faint glow of a lamp warming the room. The atmosphere was calm, almost domestic, as if we had done this 100 times before. For a while, we didn't speak much. The rain filled the silence, steady and soothing. She sat angled toward me, her knees drawn up slightly, her fingers curled around a mug of tea. I could sense her thoughts working behind her calm expression, the same guardedness she had carried since the very beginning. Finally, she broke the silence. "You know I'm afraid," she said softly, her eyes fixed on the window. "Afraid of what people will think. Afraid of how this might end. Afraid that I'll hurt you, or that you'll wake up one day and realize this was a mistake." Her voice didn't tremble, but there was a rawness in it, the sound of someone used to carrying their fears alone. I watched the way her hand tightened around the mug, as if holding it together could keep her from unraveling. I leaned closer, not to interrupt, but to let her feel I was there. "I know," I said quietly. "I can't promise I won't ever doubt myself, or that it will be easy. But I'm not afraid of complicated. I'm only afraid of not trying." That made her glance at me, searching my face for hesitation. There must have been something steady in my eyes, because slowly, cautiously, her expression softened. The next moment felt small but enormous. She let out a long breath, as though she had been holding it for years, and set her mug aside. Then she leaned into me, her head resting gently against my shoulder. I slipped my arm around her back without thinking, pulling her closer. Her hair carried the faint scent of jasmine, subtle and comforting, and the warmth of her body against mine felt like the answer to a question I hadn't known I was asking. She relaxed into me gradually, piece by piece, until I could feel the quiet rhythm of her breathing syncing with mine. We didn't kiss. We didn't need to. The closeness was enough, more than enough. Her cheek pressed lightly against my chest, and I felt the quiet steadiness of her heartbeat, a sound both fragile and strong at once. As the rain kept falling outside, I realized the warning had been true in its own way. She was complicated. She could be difficult, even dangerous, to someone unwilling to see beyond the surface. But sitting there with her, holding her in that quiet room, I knew the risk wasn't something to run from. The danger was only to my heart. And that was exactly where I wanted her to be,